Hey guys, welcome to another tutorial. We're going to have a look at particles again, but in this episode we're going to really focus on the pCustom tool. The pCustom tool alongside the normal custom tool may seem a bit daunting. At least it seemed daunting to me when I started working with Fusion. I sort of opened it up, looked at all the parameters. I thought, let's leave it. Let's leave it to another day. Then I started looking at it again, maybe a couple of months ago, and I started sort of diving into it, and I found that they're just amazingly powerful tools. It will require a bit of investment, but believe you me, it does pay off, right? So in the specific example we're going to recreate in this tutorial is the one you can see here, and you saw in the video earlier on. It's a particle matrix that is being affected affected by some mathematical equations, sine, cosine. I hope I haven't lost too many people when I start talking about mathematical equations. It's not overly hard. I had to brush up a bit on my sort of high school mathematics, but it's fairly straightforward. But we will not only be looking at this example. We will recreate it, but I will be giving hints and tips on the pCustom tool in general, and at the end of the tutorial I will also show you a bit about how I did the other examples in the video, right? This particular one, for instance, the particle cube you saw in the video, and the particle sphere, right? But the main focus will be this particular one and the pCustom tool in general. So let's start really with a new composition first, right? And let's break it down. So actually, right, for those people that are only interested in the particle grid, let me show you a very quick way to do particle grid. If you don't need to do anything else, you don't want to use sine, cosine, or expressions or anything like that, let me show you a very quick way. What you can do here is essentially Control spacebar, use the particle image emitter, right? You may have seen before. And of course a particle renderer. At first, of course, right now nothing's happened because something needs to pipe into the image emitter, namely an image. In this particular case, we're just going to add a background tool and pop it in there. And as you can see here, it is already really particle matrix, but it is very dense. So first of all, let's change the color here to white to make it a bit easier on the eye. And in the image emitter, you can change the density of the pixel. So let's lower this to 0.1, and same here, right? And let's actually change the size of the background to maybe 100 by 100 to speed it up a bit. 100 by 100. And there you go, a particle matrix. And if you want to change just the size of the particles, right, you just go in the image emitter to the style, for instance, change it to blob, and here you can change the size, right? By the way, this looks very ugly. What you'll need to do in this sort of preview, right click, go to transparency and do a full sort or a quick sort, and that will sort it out, right? So let's do something like this. So if you want to subject this grid to particle forces, you can just do the normal stuff. So say directional force, add it in here, change the conditions so that not all particles will be affected at the same time, and there you go, done. So if you're only interested in this, that's all you need to do, right? But that's not what the main tutorial is about. We wanted to look at the pCustom tool. And the other thing I want to say before we go into that, sorry about that, it may look like a bit of work to do this every time. The good news is you don't have to do this every time, right? Set it up once, set it up right, and you can reuse it time and time again. So what I typically do is I save it in the bin. So Control B to get the bin up, and go to compositions, and I've got a predefined particle grid, right? So if we put that in the renderer, right, you can see it's already there. So if I want to do something with it, all I need to do is, load this. And the way I set it up as well, and I'll show that in the tutorial, is you can just change the width here, change the depth and the spacing, right? And that's, as I said, one setup, you are on your way in no time, right? But let's recreate this. So let's start with the normal emitter and renderer. And let's go in here. As you can see, this is the sort of standard, oops, sorry about that, standard emitter, right? Over time, it just adds particles. So essentially what we want to do is line up the particles in a grid. So how do we do this? With the pCustom tool. And there we go. Of course, right now, nothing will happen because we haven't defined any expressions, anything at all, right? So it's basically almost like a pass-through. It's not affecting anything at all. But before we start affecting things, let me give you a brief explanation of the tabs, right? The numbers here are like the parameters you can use, or the variables you can use in your pCustom tool. So you can set them and you can even animate them as per normal. The way you address them in the subsequent expressions would be like number in 1, which is addressed by N1, it's by N2, N3, etc. Right? So you can use these. The setup one, these expressions are being calculated once per frame, right? And these expressions are calculated first before anything else. Secondly, the intermediate expressions are being calculated. The difference here is that these are not only calculated per frame, but also per pixel. So it's per pixel per frame. And the way you address these, or the outcome of these expressions, is by I1, I2, I3, I4. Lastly, the particle expressions, again, once per frame per particle. And there we will be spending most of our time, right? This will have, the position, rotation, velocity, color, and all that type of good stuff that will allow you to do amazing things. Yeah, let's have a look first at the position, right? So essentially, we want to line up these, in the first frame, we've got 10 particles. We would want to line them up. The way you want to do that, of course, is by checking the position here and changing the position. But how do you do that? Well, the key here is the particle ID. Each particle gets assigned with an ID. Strangely enough, I found out that the ID numbering seems to start at ID 2, not at 0, not at 1, as you would expect. I don't know the reason behind this. I don't even know if I'm completely right, but everything I do suggests it does start at ID equals 2. If you know the reason, or if you can tell me otherwise, please leave a comment below the video. But let me show what I mean here. So if I want to line these up in a row, what do? Well, if I address it by ID, all I need to do is basically type in ID. And let's change the emitter size to blob so that we can see what we're doing, and increase the size a bit. And oops, zoom out a bit. And there we can see these are all lined up. As you can see, it's not quite evenly because there is some variation in the Y and Z axis. So for now, what we do is set Y and Z to 0, and now we've got a straight line. So this will be the key to making a grid, by utilizing the ID. Right? So if, for instance, if you would put ID in here as well, right, you get a diagonal line, right? Because each time it will go up, X will increase by 1, Y will increase by 1, because both will reflect the ID. And here you can see what I said earlier on, that it seems that the ID numbering starts at 2, because you see here in the first position, that is actually position 1, 1, you would expect a particle, but there isn't any. Right? This and other things leads me to suggest, leads me to believe that indeed it starts at 2. Now, what I do then, I create an intermediate function or expression, which is very simple. Basically say I1, so intermediate 1, must equal ID minus 1. Right, and then go back to the particle tab and change the ID by I1, and ID by I1. And there you go, it starts at the right position as we would expect it. Right, so for the remainder of the tutorial, we will address the particles by I1 rather than ID. Right, but now you know why. So how do we go about and make this into a grid? Well, let me show you. We are essentially, let me show you a little PowerPoint slide, going to do something like this, right? So you see here a representation of a two-dimensional grid, right? You've got the x-axis, the y-axis. You've got here the particles. That's the way we want to line them up. You've got the particle IDs. Again, you know, 2 becomes 1 because of we're using the intermediate result I1. So, but essentially, let's just consider these the particle IDs. So the first 5 particles, if we want to have a grid that is 5 wide, would be on the first row. And then particle number 6 starts at the second row. Particle 11 starts at the third row, etc. Right? So how do we go about and do this in an expression? Well, we'll be using, first of all, considering the x-axis, we will be using what is called the modulo operation. It sounds difficult, but basically it's remainder after division. So 1 divided by 5, so, and then taking the remainder, i.e. the modulo, 1 modulo 5 equals 1, because 5 doesn't go in there even once, but the remainder is 1. For 2, it's 2. For 5, it's 0, because 5 fits into 5 one time, and there's no remainder left. For 6, right, the remainder would be 1. It goes in there one time, and the remainder is 1. So the x position we can then calculate as, well, let's have a look. If we do I1, particle ID, modulo 5, what do we get? Well, for the first particle, we get 1 modulo 5 is 1, and then for 2 would be 2, 3, 4. And then it jumps to 0, because 5 modulo 5, right, there's no remainder, it's 0. And then for 6, it goes back to 1, for 7, 2, 3, 4, and then 0 again. So this is almost what we want, but not exactly. It would work, by the way, because it would basically say, just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and then would put a particle here, sort of the 0 position, and jump to the next line. But for to keep things clear, I like the things to be lined up exactly like it is displayed here. So I put in a little condition. If the modulo of I1 modulo 5 equals 0, so in the for the fifth ID, then put it in the 5th position, right? So condition, if this condition holds true, the outcome is 5. If it doesn't hold true, so for any other ID, or so for any other result than 0, just take the normal result. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that's all as per normal, but then the result is 0. Well, hold on, the result is 0, make that 5, right? So then the result will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So basically we've sorted out the x-axis, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it would all be lined up correctly according to the x-axis. But of course, if we don't change the y, they will all end up on the same y position, right? So what do we want to do there? It's a very simple thing. We're going to use the ceil operation. Ceil operation is basically rounding up to the nearest integer, right? So simply put, 1, say if you divide 1 by 5, 0.2, nearest rounded up integer would be 1. 3 divided by 5, same thing, 1. 5 divided by 5, still 1. But when we get to 6, 6 divided by 5 is 1.2, rounded up is 2. So as of particle 6, right, if we use this expression, it would jump to y position 2. Similarly, if you do 11 divided by 5, right, it goes in there in principle 2 times, but if you divide by 5, 11 by 5, you get, basically if you round it up, you get 3. Right, so all we need to do is basically apply these expressions, and then we should get a grid. Right, so let's have a look at that. Let's implement this. So the X position, we basically said if I1 by 5 equals 0. So the equals, by the way, in an expression is twice the equal sign. It's one of those things. So if it is 0, make it 5. Otherwise, make it just the result of the operation I1. And there we go. So that's that one out of the way. Next one up then is this one, the Y position, seal I1, oops, divided by 5. And there we go, right? The start of a particle grid. Now we want to make this more scalable, right? So instead of 5, right? We basically want to say, okay, I want to make the width variable, right? By changing the numbers. So if we choose number 1 to represent the width, let's make this 5. We will just replace the 5 here with N1 each time we had that 5 to represent the width. N1 and N1 and here N1, right? Same result as you would expect. But now if we say increase the number to 7, right? You see it becomes 7 wide. We only have got 10 particles, so you don't see the full row here. But say if you do 3, right, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, so 10 particles in total, 3 times 3 plus 1. So this represents the width. Now I want to make it a bit better because right now, as you can see here, it allows other values than integers, right? So I want to change that. So the way you can do that is go up here, right click on pCustom, edit controls, look for the control, number in 1. I'll actually change the name here and do dash width so that I know what I'm working with. Ensure that it remains on the numbers tab. Right, so I need to ensure you set this. Here we select integer. The range sort of that is sort of shown would 1 to 100, but I could make it anything really. And you know, input control, screw control, that's all fine. So if we see this here now, right, we can just change it here, and it will only allow integers. Right? Now for the height, currently, as you may have noticed, there's nothing in here that specifies the height. The height is purely specified by the number of particles that are coming in. Right? If in the emitter, go to the controls, we set the initial particles to 100. See? Because it just continues on with the functions, with the operations, right? With the modulo and the seal, and it just keeps on going. So if you want to make this a bit fancier, you basically can say, okay, I want the number to be determined by the size of the grid I want. So if I want to have a grid of 10 by 10, right, I need to have 10 by 10 is 100 particles. So I need to define the height. We've defined the width by N1, so let's define the height for N2, right? So let's go to N2 and change the name and the some of the properties again. So edit controls, go down here, number in 2, and do here dash height so that we know what we're working with. We remain on the numbers tab. We only allow integers, standard range 1 to 100, and the rest is okay. Right, so now we've got the width and height. Right, so let's change this to say 10. No. Right, now it is not doing anything yet. Right, the height is purely determined by the number of particles. So what we want to do is make the number of particles dependent on the width and the height. So let's just pin it here, right, so that we can easily pick whip to these variables. In the emitter, in a number, add an expression. So essentially we're saying, okay, I want to have that N1 times N2 here, right? But I only want to have that for the very first frame if time is 0, because I don't want any other particles to be emitted after that. For other purposes, you may want to have particles after that, but for the purpose here, we don't. So here, add an expression, if with double I, and that's one of the tricky things here, in some of the nodes, or most of the nodes, the way the syntax works here, there are various ways of doing it, but if you do it like this, you need to have the double I here. I won't go into the detail right now, but in these nodes you will need to have the double I. If you work in pCustom, you don't. All right, there's more to it. It has to do with Lua syntax and other syntax, but let's, you know, just remind yourself of that. So if time equates to 0, then basically I want to have this number times number in 2, right? And if it is anything else than times 0, so the second condition, then I'm going to have 0 particles. Oops. And that basically should do the trick. So if we zoom out here, right, we see a perfect grid. Go back to pCustom if we want to change the width, right? It is just perfect, right? So that's the grid out of the way. Actually, one more thing. If I want to change the spacing in between here, we need to introduce a third variable. Let's actually quickly do that. And let's use the number in 3 for the third variable. All right, so edit controls, we go to number in 3, call that spacing. And let's ensure it remains on the numbers tab. And it will be, well, it doesn't need to be an integer, actually. Well, it doesn't really matter. Let's not have that, but let's have a default of 4. Could be anything really, and let's allow 1 to 10. But again, there's no strict rule or anything like that. All right, so now we've got a width parameter. So what do we need to do here to include it here? So the width parameter, so it's the spacing. So all we need to do is basically saying, okay, position here is 1, but if we want to have a smaller one, right? So if you want to have less space in between, all you need to do is divide it by that new spacing. So n3, right? So it's the outcome of this, but actually let's put it in between brackets. So this is n3, and let's set n3 to a reasonable number. So it's not set to anything now. So let's set to 2. And let's divide the outcome here as well by n3. So n1 divided by n3, but also this one here, I'll put it in between brackets again, divided by n3. Right. So now if we change the spacing, right, you see the spacing changing. So now we've got a fully scalable grid. And that's really the first part of the tutorial done. Right, we've got our grid. Again, as you can see, it's a lot more involved than just using the image emitter. However, as said, we can just save this, right? So if we want to do this, save, select everything, bring up the bins, go to compositions, and all you need to do is drag it in here and then save it as, say, particle grid, just now. Tutorial, save, and now each time you want to do this, just go to the bin, drag this in, and you're done. Right, and then you don't need to set it up ever again. And then from here, you use that as the basis. So, but what we want to do here is what we had in the example video, right? We want to make it subject to these mathematical functions. So let's start working on that. I won't go into the detail of all the sine and cosine functions, right? I may have another tutorial for that. For now, just try to follow this, just type as I type along. But my main message is play around with it, right? You know, sometimes you will have something that work well, otherwise it won't work well, and change the parameters, tweak it, have a play with it. That is really my main message. And stick with it. So really what we want to do is here, I want to have a sine function for x. I want that to happen as of frame 1, really, in this particular case. So I'm going to build another condition around this. So if, between brackets, it's frame 1, so time equals 0, then do what I had before, right? So this whole thing. Otherwise, basically do this, then take the position you already had, px, and then add some stuff to it, right? In our particular case, what we're going to add is a cosine function. Make that dependent on time, but I want to have some variety based on the particle ID, right? Otherwise, all particles will be affected in the same way. So basically say, okay, let's do times time minus the particle ID, well, the intermediate one, I1, and let's divide the whole thing by 50. Right? These may seem a bit arbitrary, but I obtained these by tweaking, right? So what happens here? So if we conclude this and if we start playing, right, you see something happening. By the way, you saw them disappearing because the lifespan of the particles is too short. So I set it to 1000. Go back to the custom tool and I'll play again. Right, you see it moving. It's not quite as impressive yet as the example we want to recreate, but that we will get to by looking first of all at the second expression. Right, so let's do something similar here. So let's build this if condition around it. If time equals 0, then do this. Otherwise, take the original y position and add some of the movement. So we do a very similar thing, and now we use sine instead of cosine, times time, minus. In this case, I'm doing I1 divided by 5, close bracket, and divide the whole thing by 10. Again, these are values I tweaked beforehand and then closed off to end the condition. Forgot the plus here. Right, so here we go. Look at this happening. So things are happening now. So we've got movement on the x and the y axis. Okay, let's now change the z expression because we want to bring in some movement for the z axis. So let's do something similar. Sine, and I've got 2 times the open brackets times 4 minus I1, and 2 times close. As you can see here, now it starts doing some interesting stuff. Now it's not quite like the example because I swapped a few things around. I swapped the y and x axis around. So actually let's do this again. And let's copy this whole thing over to here, to the sets. But of course then change the py to pz. And let's change this into what we had there. So let's just quickly retype sine time times 4 minus I1. Close that. Right, and now the positioning will be similar to what we had in the actual example. Right, so now we've got the following result, which is not quite the same as in the example we had before, right? It's just all a bit more sedate. So we need to tweak some of the variables a bit because it's very important. That's why I said at the start, right? Tweak to your heart's content. Right, so one of the things I want to do is change the height here because I want to have a bit of a lengthier matrix. So let's change that to 20. Right, so now it's longer. But as in the original example, it was sort of almost folding onto its own, onto itself. So we can do that by tweaking the spacing a bit. So here we make the spacing a bit smaller, right? So they're closer together. And let's have a look now. Let's zoom in a bit. And let's change the angle. Right, and this is looking a lot more like the example we had in the video. Right, again, change the position a bit of the camera, or of the perspective. We'll add a camera later on. Now, the other thing we did in the example was basically altered the colors, right? So let's go to the next one. We're going to alter the particle color based on a number of parameters, right? In this particular case, I just looked at the red and left the rest as is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to vary the amount of red in the particle by looking at the ID. Right, so if I say, okay, I want to have it based on the ID, again, we're using I1 for that, divide that by 200, and also make it dependent on the Y position. So then PY. So now, when you play it, you see you start getting this movement based on the ID, and then as some of the particles go up, right? If the PY increases, the amount of red goes up. Now, the last thing I did in terms of the expressions on this tab is altering the size of the particle. And we can do that as well here. And again, we can do that based on the particle ID, right? So for instance, I could say, okay, make it I1, but it will be incredibly large, right? Way too large. So divide it by 500. And then we get something like this, which is almost the same as the example we had, right? But for my liking, the particles at the start are too small. So I introduce another little function here. It's the max function. So if I say max, it takes basically the max function takes the maximum of two values. So if I have a value defined here of 0.2 and this one, it will always take the maximum of these two values. So essentially it means the minimum value of the whole thing will be 0.2. Right, so now you see variety, but less variety because the minimum will always be 0.2. Right, but you can tweak it. Right, so if you say, okay, well, actually, I want to make that 0.1. Right, and they're smaller. The smallest particles will be smaller. You say, well, I actually want, oh, sorry, my apologies. If you want that to be 0.1, I mistyped that. Then we get this result. Make it, oops. If you want to make it 0.3, again, all the particles will be bigger. If we want the biggest particles to be bigger, right, then divide it by something smaller here, right, or maybe even 350. Oh, that is wrong. 2 additional zeros. Right, and now we get something like this. Again, tweaking. So as you can see, it requires a bit of tweaking and such, but now you can see this looks remarkably similar to the original example I've shown. Now we need to think about a few more things. I want to add some glow, and I want to add maybe another few bits and bobs. So first of all, I want to have a renderer, right, so that I can render it here, but as you can see, nothing is happening at this point in time because I haven't really introduced a camera. So let me add a merge node first, and let's pipe a camera into that. Camera into the merge node. Show the merge here, right, in viewport 1, and do basically copy over the perspective that we currently see to the camera. Now you can see that the renderer is following this. right? We can change some of the settings, of course, in the renderer. So first of all, I want to have it to be open GL. Then we need to ensure we've got the quick sort selected here, right? And we're not going to use any lighting, so we can change. We can keep everything as is here. Last thing I want to do though is after the renderer, I want to introduce a sort of black background. Actually, no, first let's add a glow. So let's add a glow to all the particles and show that here. Way too much here, so we need to reduce the gain somewhat. Right. And now we can add a black background. Right, so put that in here and show the merge. And now, essentially, we're done with the example. All right. As you guys can see, you know, sometimes you really need to tweak the values. I don't get everything right first time around, and I think it was very, very plain to see. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this bit. If you're so inclined, hang on and I'll show you a bit about the other examples. I'll give you a few hints and tips. Right? So, in this particular example, I worked obviously not with a particle grid, but I defined a sort of a spherical type function. Right? So if you look at the pCustom here, at the particle tab, I mucked around with sine functions a fair bit, right? If you want to do quickly a screen grab, go for it. As said at the start, I may make these projects available for download anyways. But yeah, essentially, it's all based on mathematics to define a sphere, and then I change that sphere, the parameters over time. I added a few other bits and bobs here, rays, right? You can see here the ray function, right? It's very, I added very subtly, and a soft glow, and essentially that's it, right? Particle cube explosion, I call that. It's basically based on a particle grid, but I added a third dimension, right? Let's have a quick look at that. Here you see the third dimension here defined. Again, if there's enough interest, I may walk you guys through it in a separate tutorial. And again, I may make this available for download, but please let me know if you're interested. Lastly, this particular example, again, is based on a sphere-like function. And what I did here is once I defined the sphere, it's fairly straightforward. I added a directional force, right, to make it drop, and then a bounce, and let it bounce off a surface, and basically not having any variance or spin or anything like that, and ensure the elasticity is less than 1, so that the bounce will be less and less each time, right? And that really results in that what you saw earlier on, right? So you can briefly see it bouncing and then gradually coming to a halt. As you can see here, I actually animated the elasticity as well, right? But I think that's basically it for this tutorial. Again, if you're interested in any further explanations, let me know. In the meantime, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and have a great day. Take care.